Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our really terrific event today. I'm very excited to be doing this event on feminism in China and a new book that's out by Lita Hong Fincher. And before I introduce our speakers, I'll just say I'm Bonnie Glaser. I direct the China Power Project here at CSIS. And we do occasional book launches, but I'm always really excited when it's, I've actually had a chance to read the book, and it's a topic that I feel is really an important one. So let me first introduce Lita, who is she's a scholar, a journalist, and of course, author of Betraying Big Brother, The Feminist Awakening in China, which has recently come out. And her first book was a also critically acclaimed book called Leftover Women, The Resurgence of Gender Inequality in China. And I'm very glad to have with us as a discussant and to participate in the conversation about Chinese feminism, Mei Fang, who is also a journalist. She used to work at the Wall Street Journal, was the China correspondent there, and the author of One Child Story of China's Most Radical Experiment, which won a nonfiction award from the American Society of Journalists and Authors. And Mei Fang is a fellow at New America and named one of the top 50 influencers on US-China relations by Foreign Policy magazine. So this book, and we're going to start with a presentation by Leda, is really about the conflict between the Chinese government's crackdown on feminist activities and the emergence of a broader feminist movement in China. And we're going to talk about the implications for women and the role of feminists and the interaction between women and Chinese government. And so what we'll do is we'll have Leda give her presentation, and then we'll have a discussion among the three of us. We'll then open up the floor to questions from all of you, and we'll close at about 5:15, where we will be selling books, and of course the author will be available to sign books as well. So we'll start with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And I actually wanted to know, how do I advance the slides? Okay, thank you so much. So, first of all, I'd like to thank CSIS for inviting me here today, in particular Bonnie Glaser, and also thanks to Kelly Flaherty for organizing a lot of the logistical arrangements. And thank you so much, Mei Fang, my good friend, and also I really admire your work and your book, One Child. So I wanted to just explain to you, first of all, the genesis of this book, which was the jailing in 2015 of 5 young women. There were actually quite a lot of feminist activists in different Chinese cities who were planning to celebrate International Women's Day by handing out anti-sexual harassment stickers on subways and buses. But even before they actually carried out their activity, the Chinese police carried out a really sweeping round of arrests in several different cities, detained a bunch of feminist activists. And then they ended up focusing on 5 young women who became known as the Feminist Five. These are the 5 women here. They brought all 5 young women to Beijing, put them in the same detention center. And it looked as though these women were on track to being criminally prosecuted. The government was experimenting with various different possible charges, but effectively it looked like they were going to be prosecuted for disturbing the social order. So in jailing these 5 young women, the government really wanted to try to wipe out the possibility of a large-scale feminist movement in China. But in fact, that move drastically backfired because it just galvanized the Chinese feminist community within China. And not just the feminist community. There were also workers who had been helped by feminist activists who'd been involved in the labor rights movement for years, for example. And so in addition to the outcry inside China, there was a huge global outcry. I want to quickly skip through some of the slides. But so the global outcry was very important. And if you see here on the upper left-hand side is a tweet from Hillary Clinton, who was then considered to be the front runner for the US president. And she tweeted her outrage. She said, "See, hosting a meeting on women's rights at the UN while persecuting feminists, shameless." And really, it was the timing of the jailing of these young women that was so outrageous, because Chinese President Xi Jinping was preparing to host the UN World Conference on Women in New York just several months later. And so the blatant hypocrisy of the Chinese president hosting a conference to promote women's rights while at home they were jailing young women merely for planning to celebrate International Women's Day, the hypocrisy was so outrageous. And at that time, the global diplomatic pressure was quite intense. And so it wasn't just United States politicians, there were also heads of state from other countries. People actually staged protests in other cities outside China. And so after this unprecedented outcry over the jailing of the 5 young women, the Chinese government actually released them. They released them after 37 days. And so it was at that point that I became interested in going and interviewing these women. And in fact, I knew one of them, Li Maizi, of the Feminist Five. I had written about her a little bit for my first book, and I was deeply concerned about her and the other women. So after several months, when the women were under de facto house arrest, I made trips to several different cities, to Beijing, Hangzhou, and Guangzhou, and Hong Kong as well, to interview members of the Feminist Five. And then as I conducted these interviews, I realized that actually there's a lot more to this feminist network than I had realized, that it's much deeper and broader than I had understood to be the case. And that's how my interest in this book grew. And in fact, the title of the book, Betraying Big Brother, comes from one of the Feminist Five herself, Wei Tingting, who describes when she was detained, and in fact, when all of these 5 young women were detained, the first thing that the interrogators did, that Chinese state security agents did, was to confiscate their glasses. And 4 of the 5 young women wore glasses. And Wei Tingting herself was severely visually impaired. So without her glasses, she was blind. She couldn't see anything. And it was in the middle of winter, so it was below freezing. And the agents put her into an isolation ward. They also took her snow boots and her coat. So she was freezing. They confiscated her glasses so she couldn't see anything. And she wrote in an online essay, which was later deleted, that she called Prison Notes. She wrote this essay that she posted online in Chinese about how she was overcome by this feeling of powerlessness and terror. But then she started to hear the voices of some of the other feminists that she had worked with before. She heard them because the police had rounded up so many feminists and brought them all together in the same place. So Wei Tingting put her ear up against the wall of the cell so she could hear more closely. And then she actually identified some of the women around her who were in detention. And that's what began to give her hope back. And she started doing things like singing. She started singing, and then another one of the feminists who were in detention sang back to her. And they were singing this anthem of the feminist movement called A Song for All Women. And so that connection that these women made, hearing each other's voices, letting each other know that they were not alone, that was what buoyed Wei Tingting's spirits. And she describes in her personal essay about the experience that even though she could hear the clanking of the guards, the clanking of the keys of guards walking back and forth outside her cell, she discovered the joy of betraying Big Brother. So that's where that title comes from. So the book itself, I'm going to skip over this part. The book itself is full of a lot of narratives, which I hope that some of you will read because they're truly fascinating and very inspiring stories of the bravery and incredible determination of these very young women. But I want to talk here a little bit with the remainder of my time about something that I call patriarchal authoritarianism. I think in a lot of the scholarship and the writing about why it is that China's Communist Party has been able to survive for so many years in spite of the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union and across Eastern Europe. There are so many different theories about what has enabled the Chinese Communist Party to persist. And in fact, now China's communist rule has outlasted that of the Soviet Union. And I argue that one of the most critical factors in China's maintaining its authoritarian rule over the entire country is actually based on patriarchy, on the subjugation of women, on misogyny and sexism. And so there are many, many ways, and I describe this in detail in the book, there are many ways in which the government, for a long time, but especially today, it's been intensified today under Chinese President Xi Jinping, has been aggressively pushing traditional gender norms, pushing women to return to the home, to become dutiful wives and mothers, and thereby contributing to the political stability of the nation. And let me just give you an example. So up here are some of the images that you see. They've been televised on Chinese state television. They've been written about in the People's Daily or Xinhua News. There's this new concept that has emerged under Chinese President Xi Jinping, which is the family state under heaven, 家国天下. And essentially, the idea is that there is a strong man ruler, the patriarch, who is ruling over this great accretion of families. So China is one great family. And this is a literal quote from Xinhua from last year. Xi stresses the importance of family values. He says little family, 小家, but he has in mind the big family, 国家. 家 means family in Chinese, and 国家, which means nation state, is what they're referring to. China is a big family. And it's really striking. If you look at the images, on top you see Xi Jinping he's playing his proper role as the father to his child. But even more importantly, underneath, he is the filial son who's taking care of his mother. And a lot of the rhetoric or propaganda that is being spread by Chinese state media today really harkens back to Confucian didactic texts about the proper role of women, everybody's proper role, but the idea of womanly virtue, what that means, what a woman's rightful place in society and in the family should be, that is critical to maintaining the nation's stability. So as an example, this is a Qing dynasty text, biographies of exemplary women. The daughter obeys her parents, the daughter-in-law reverently serves her parents-in-law, etc. When every family is harmonious, the state is well governed. And we see a lot of that kind of message the resurgence of Confucianism, hearkening back to China's great traditional culture, which of course was obliterated in the early communist era. Well, that's making a huge comeback today. And the role of women and men as well it is absolutely essential, everybody playing their proper role. And so there's also the figure of Xi Jinping himself, who has now developed, a lot of people have written about this personality cult, that it has parallels with the Mao Zedong era. And the personality cult is really actually hyper-masculine. It emphasizes the manliness of Xi Jinping. And I'd like to draw your attention to the first major speech that Xi Jinping made in January 2013, right after he became General Secretary of the Communist Party. He said the Soviet Communist Party had more members than we do, but nobody was man enough to stand up and resist. That's very interesting language. So the implication is that he, Xi Jinping, is the man. He is manly enough to stand up to all of these grave dangers, the efforts to try to infiltrate China from the West. And he is going to stand up to those hostile forces and protect China and protect the Communist Party and ensure its survival and thriving long past the time when it collapsed in the Soviet Union. So a lot of the rhetoric about women in this role, I'm going to skip over this just in the interest of time. But this is where women are, the role of women is particularly crucial, because women in China today no longer want to play, or I should say, do not want to play that role. Young women today are increasingly pushing back against that very strong pressure for them to get married when they're young and to have babies. And it coincides with, and this is something that we're going to discuss with Bonnie and May as well, it coincides with, in 2016, a dramatic abandonment of this policy that lasted over 35 years, the so-called one-child policy. After more than 35 years of really all these incredibly egregious violations of women's rights, such as forced abortions or the mass insertion of IUDs. I mean, that's been so widely documented. After more than 35 years, the Communist Party reversed course, and now it is aggressively pushing propaganda aimed at particularly young, educated Han Chinese women, trying to push them into marrying and having not just one, but two babies before they turn 30. So I want to just show you a couple of examples of the kind of propaganda I'm talking about. This was an article that coincided with the announcement from the Chinese government that it was going to abandon the so-called one-child policy. At the end of 2015, this was in the People's Daily, and the headline for the story was, "Female university students with babies, brighter job prospects. Student moms on the rise." Look at this picture here, which really, to me, evokes Margaret Atwood's dystopian novel, The Handmaid's Tale. Okay, I'm really running out of time here. But this picture, there is no face on the mother. But what counts is that that figure, the black figure, has a mortarboard. So that woman is educated, but it's so symbolic of the fact that the government views women as these biological vessels for the delivery of babies. And this is very much important in realizing the Communist Party's goal of seeing women as reproductive tools of the state. So just before we get into the discussion, just a couple more pictures here. This was an article with the headline, "You'd better believe it, under 30 are women's best years for getting pregnant." And underneath this article is actually trying to urge young women who are still in college to have babies. Female university students, joyful love. Freshman year, live together. Sophomore year, get pregnant. Junior year, have baby. So you see these young women, newly graduated from college, all happily surrounding the baby carriage. That's their future, how happy they are. And the woman on the right not only has one child, she's already holding her toddler, but she's very visibly pregnant with yet another baby. And I'm going to wrap it up here so that we can get into the discussion. The backdrop to all of this is the position that China finds itself in now with economic growth slowing, with birth rates falling, the severe aging of the population, and the shrinking of the workforce. And so the government has decided that the key to trying to get through these very difficult years ahead is to try to get women, particularly educated Han Chinese women, to have more babies. And maybe in our discussion we could also talk about the role of eugenics and Xinjiang, but I will just end it there. Thank you very much.
That was great, highlighting some of the really major points in the book, and I really want to dig into a couple of things that I found really especially interesting in the book. And I want to start with the subject of how rapid economic development affected women's rights in China, because you write about this a lot in the book. So can you just comment on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you look at the history of women under communism, the early communist era really upheld gender equality as a founding principle, and gender equality was written into the Constitution of the People's Republic. And so in those early years, in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s, the propaganda was very much women can do whatever men can do. And the party wanted to assign, or it did assign women en masse to jobs in factories and in the fields. And so by the end of the 1970s, the urban employment rate for women was around 90%, which is just staggeringly high female labor force participation. But then with the onset of market reforms, a lot of that gender equality, economic equality I'm talking about, a lot of that became unraveled with the dismantling of the planned economy. So, for example, in the 80s and particularly in the 90s, with the restructuring of the state-owned enterprises, as they began to shut down some of these state-owned enterprises, women were the first to lose their jobs, and then women were the last to be rehired. But in many ways, gender inequality just came roaring back in many, many different ways, which I recount in my first book. One of the things that I've written about is the soaring gender wealth gap. Not just the gender income gap, which has grown dramatically, but also, I argue even more important than that is actually the fact that women, by and large, have been shut out of this incredible growth of property wealth with the privatization of the housing market, and so many other ways. Female labor force participation is now falling by the year.
So, May, you've written a lot about the one-child policy, so I really want to ask you about the challenges that the Chinese government faces in trying to grow the population in China, as it later talked about encouraging young women to have children. And we can look out, and there are estimates about the demographic problem, where there will be so many people that are older and very few people that are younger. And so finally, the Chinese government has basically done away with this policy. But my question to you is, do they have a chance of succeeding? What are the obstacles? Do women want to have more children? Is the Chinese government giving enough incentives to women to have more children?
Right, and that's a great question, and it really ties in with Leda's thesis, which is about the rising gender inequality, because one of the reasons for this rising gender inequality is demographics. Now, their population is down to population growth. Is you either grow it or you buy it, right? You import your growth in, which is very hard for China to do because it's never historically been a very open society for immigration, which also brings in a lot of problems, or you grow it. And that's what they're trying to do now. They're trying to grow it organically. But one of the problems they have also in terms of organic growth is they want a certain type of growth, right? You want workers, but you want educated workers because productivity is all. So who makes the most? Educated workers or educated women? So basically they're in a bind because they need to get women to take on one of the toughest jobs, which is the least paid, least well production. I mean, all the statistics are globally, right? Women take a hit when they have children. Women take professional career setbacks. So from that particular demographic that they want to produce more is the hardest one to persuade. And we can look at all the demographic statistics across the world. It's all the same. Educated, you want fewer kids, you educate women, you give them opportunities. So how do you get more kids? And that's the crux. I think most of the numbers show that in developed societies, and there's a close parallel between gender equality and birth rates. So you want women to have more kids, you gotta have more gender inequality. Men have to help out at home. So this is at war with the patriarchal system in China right now. So this is very hard. So I would argue that it's very unlikely. I mean, a lot of this is very expensive. To raise birth rates organically, you have to basically give a package of incentives, a huge amount. And historically, China has been very good at the stick, and so far not the carrot. And we are not yet seeing any carrots, not very many. Right now we're seeing a lot of sweeping kind of pushbacks in terms of reducing, for example, encouragements historically for late marriage. They used to give longer leave, companies used to give longer vacation if you got married later. That's been rolled back. We've seen, for example, more workplace discrimination that women are reporting now that they can have more children than employers. And there's no legislation to protect that for women so far that we see. So that's the worrying part, that increasingly what we're seeing is a rising social pressure to push women into having more children. Now, whether that works, it's always much easier to turn off the tap than it is to turn it on. So this is going to be the interesting phase that we're going to see with China going forward.
Could both of you address the question of how much awareness there is in China these days about feminism and women's rights? How much is this really changing? So if we talk about generally the challenges, whether it pertains to having equality in the workplace or salaries, things like that, sexual harassment, domestic violence, how much awareness is there in China today? If you go on WeChat, is this something that the Chinese government tries to remove, or are these kinds of discussions going on? You want to start, Leda?
Sure. Well, I mean, this is a big theme of my book. I subtitled The Feminist Awakening in China because I think it's really quite astounding what has happened in the last, even just 5 years, but particularly in the last 3 years since the jailing of the Feminist Five in 2015. I mean, that was a real turning point, I believe, because before that, there were a lot of young women who were very unhappy. And in fact, when I wrote my first book, I was really demoralized because I did so many extensive interviews with these extremely well-educated young women who were very, very intelligent, and yet they felt that there was nothing they could do in many cases, that they were really unhappy when they got married. They would often marry somebody they really didn't like even, and then when they married, they often would hand over their life savings to have the marital home be solely in the man's name. And yet so many of these young women just did not have the awareness that I was hoping they would have, even though they were very unhappy. So, and then around 2012, there were these small groups of feminist activists. I write about some of whom ended up being jailed in 2015, who were doing these acts of performance art about various issues like sexual harassment or domestic violence, or gender discrimination in university admissions. And with that, at the same time, over the last few years, and also the internet has played a big role in this as well. I write about the most influential feminist social media account, Feminist Voices, that took off. It really took off in 2011. And then it was just banned a few months ago, the night of International Women's Day. But with the jailing of the Feminist Five in 2015, the government identified feminism itself as a threat. And so it tried to wipe out what could potentially become large-scale force, but that drastically backfired. It's so many young women who stood on the sidelines in the past started to actively embrace feminism. And so since then, of course, right at the year after the jailing of the Feminist Five, it was a very difficult year. The crackdown on these activists was really intense, even though they released the jailed women. But in the last couple of years, and particularly we see this year with the blossoming of MeToo as well in China, that in spite of a very intense government crackdown on feminist activism online and also offline in many, many ways that I recount in the book, in spite of the government's effort to just wipe out this movement, it's continuing to grow. I mean, the momentum is just astounding to me. And so the awareness today is so much greater than it was just a few years ago.
For myself, I think in China in general, there's a sort of a resistance to the idea of being called a feminist. But that said, there is a certain willingness to subscribe to the things of equal pay or equal, parity in the home, all these things. So I think the resistance is strongest with this whole demographic push, because that's exactly where women will vote with their wombs. They're saying, a lot of them are saying, no, I'm not producing number 2, and I'm going to have to do all the work. No, I'm not going to produce number 3. I'm not even do 1. So that's where we see, I think, the strongest resistance, because this is the most private and intimate decision that will most impact the woman.
What about in the area of legislation? So what legislation exists on the books to protect women? And is it a problem of legislation that needs to be created, or is it simply a problem of enforcement, as we have seen in other areas such as intellectual property rights, protection? You could have a lot of laws on the books, but you may not see that actually enforced. So is the problem in both areas, or is it mostly enforcement?
I think both, because China typically, historically, for lots of things is enforcement, right? But for this particular case, it's straight down to legislation. There are very few, I think, next to no workplace legislation to protect women from discrimination or sexual harassment. In universities, for example, most of them don't have that rule that says you can't date your students, which is a major issue, which is what we're seeing with MeToo. A lot of the professors are harassing their students or having sex with them or treating their students like personal harems. I know several people who do that. Won't go into names here, but yeah, but there's no rule against it. There isn't really, and even, so we can't even get to talk about enforcement if there's no rule to start with.
Yeah, I mean, well, let's take domestic violence as, I think that's a really good example to look at, because there was no domestic violence law in China until 2016, and when this heralded, much lauded landmark law on domestic violence was finally passed and enacted after at least 15 years of activism. And so it was widely written about, but now 2.5 years later, we see that law is not being enforced. So I personally believe that enough time has elapsed for us to conclude that the Chinese government passed that law just so that it could appear to be a more international global leader, because it is simply not being enforced. I mean, all of the women on the ground, or it is largely women, who are monitoring the implementation and enforcement of such things as restraining orders. I mean, there is virtually no enforcement. And so I think that this is part of a deliberate strategy by the Communist Party to keep women down. And so they don't care about violence against women. And in fact, not only do they not care, I actually believe that this is part of their governing strategy, is that let's just let men abuse women in the privacy of their home or in the workplace, or, and we're just not going to take it seriously, because that's part of their ability to maintain their rule over the population, that men will not rise up against the Communist Party as long as they are not interfered with. Because if you actually look at what would be necessary to implement this law properly, to actually enforce all of these restraining orders, that would mean having to punish, millions of men, in theory, millions of men, but there is discussion now, I think in response to the MeToo movement, there is now discussion of a new anti-sexual harassment civil code. And so I think that's purely probably in reaction to the MeToo movement, because the government has to show that it's trying to listen to women's demands. But I just do not hold out much faith in these kinds of laws, because so many of them they appear to be good on the books, but then they're not implemented.
I think one of the issues which perhaps we can draw a parallel with in the US is every society that's under threat or feels itself to be under threat, exists a strong reaction. So for us in America, there's a sense of demographic change, which is leading to a strong rise of white supremacist movements, for example. In China, one of the big issues is gender dynamics, because there is a huge gender imbalance, partly as a result of the one-child policy. So, so part of this is what's happening. Men are sort of feeling themselves under threat, because of this. There are 30 million more single men than women now. That's the statistic. Some go as high as 40 or 50 million, depending on how far you move the counter. So, this is a society in flux and instability. So one of the rises, there's a rise in this thing called the Confucian workshops. It's not Confucius Institute. These are workshops which sort of herald back to traditional past values. So they hold these workshops for men who are very disaffected, and they tell them all about how men should rule. That's number one. They tell women do also show up for these workshops. They say, okay, don't fight back if your husband beats you. Your husband is number one. Don't irritate him. You let your man be the power in the household. So these are all sort of retrograde, back to the past kind of things that are actually gaining popularity, and some of them are state-sponsored. Many of them have state-sponsored links.
Yeah, could I jump in there? In fact, quite a few of them are state-sponsored. I mean, there are these extreme morality schools that are not state-sponsored. But I actually, on my original PowerPoint slide, I had a slide of this new school that was recently opened that was sponsored by the All China Women's Federation. And it's called the New Era Woman School, where they teach women things like how to apply makeup, how to groom themselves, how, good posture, how to behave in the correct way according to traditional Chinese culture, how to be deferential. And I think that we're going to see more of these kinds of efforts directly coming from the government. And another effort that's been going on for quite a long time is also mass matchmaking festivals, and now the Communist Youth League is sponsoring these mass matchmaking efforts that focus on educated Han Chinese, trying to get them, to get married. But there's a lot of resistance. Young people don't want to do that. They don't want to be controlled by the government to that degree.
Yeah, I always use Singapore as a template a little bit, because I spent time there. I went to college there, and Singapore is sort of like some similarities. It's sort of a controlled environment, attempt to rule democratic, very Han Chinese population. So one of the things the government did to sort of encourage population growth, marriage and courting, was to start up a matchmaking agency. They called it the Social Development Unit, the SDU. And of course, people started calling it single, desperate, and ugly. But what was the point with it was sort of eugenics, because they had an SDU, and that was strictly for graduates only. And then they had the SDS, which was for non-graduates. So clearly the message was, graduates make graduates, and non-graduates, you stick somewhere else. Yeah.
So before we go to the audience for their questions, I want to ask one last question, sort of tie together a couple of things. And you talked about the Feminist Five being released. I think you said 37 days they were held. So why were they released? Obviously, the government detains people, doesn't feel responsible to provide any real explanation. There is no due process, and so all of a sudden they were released. So I'd like to have you comment on that, and then connect that to what might work in the future to influence government policies, whether we talk about things that might be done domestically within China or internationally, what governments or feminist groups can do. Is there a way to develop more effective strategies or tactics to get the government to respond to some of the concerns of women?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the release of the Feminist Five is just one example showing that actually very loud or strong global diplomatic pressure really does work. It has an effect on the Chinese government. So there are so many pundits who say, no, you can't you can't embarrass the Chinese government because they're going to lose face. You've got to do it in private. But I really believe that it was that incredible global outcry. And it was primarily the global aspect because inside China, you know, the government didn't care that much, and there was a news blackout about the Feminist Five inside. So even though there were these activist-sponsored social media efforts to try to release the Feminist Five, I think it was primarily the global pressure and the appearance of the timing was just so. It was so egregious with Xi Jinping about to host this World Conference on Women in New York. You know, the Chinese government would just look terrible hosting this conference while jailing these young women. And I think that was a really strong factor. And it does show you as well, I mean, let's take Xinjiang, for example, and the mass internment of Uyghurs. You know, with around reports that are around 1 million Uyghurs are in these mass internment camps. And the fact is now that there is more news coverage and there is more of a pushback coming from parts of the US Congress, that now the Chinese government has shifted its strategy to try to say, look, I mean, obviously the propaganda attempts that it's pushing now saying, look, these mass internment camps are actually really good for the Uyghurs. But it is a sign that the government is responsive to public pressure, diplomatic pressure. And I think that that's so critically important, that's really missing in so many cases. I mean, look at when Liu Xiaobo died in custody, there hardly any heads of state said anything about that. And it's such a travesty.
I'm a little bit more of a cynic. I always think that with China, the levers that work best are the economic levers. Money works best. So I think one of the big problems that we have right now, say, for example, the US leadership, is the bowing out of so many of these things like the TPP, for example, which could have forced given us some leverage in terms of demanding like higher standards of labor, for example. So I don't have a solution, but I always think that follow the money is where the key. I perhaps possibly with the One Belt One Road initiative that China has, its partners in that way can sort of help persuade some of the changes along the way, because they'll say, well, look, we don't want to partner with you if you don't have certain things. So money, I think, is always going to be key.
No, I totally agree with you, but I think that money, that financial pressure, definitely needs to accompany any kind of expressed outrage, but there has to be some kind of strong response, as well as just private discussions of incentives. There needs to be some kind of threat of retaliation as well.
And maybe I should add, just for, to your point later, is the problem now is I think we're going ahead to sort of much more rocky waters in terms of U.S.-China relationships, the new Cold War, the new Skull War, whatever you call it. And I think there's a need to distinguish between the Chinese state and the Chinese people. That we increasingly, that needs to be more in the media sphere, that we need to sort of say, well, look, this is what the government is doing, but this is what the people are doing, because so many of these initiatives are coming from China itself, as Leda has documented in her book.
Absolutely, very good point. So we're going to take some questions from the audience, and please wait for the microphone. Identify yourself, and then if you would ask a question, and not too lengthy, so we can hopefully get in a number of them. Yes, right here.
Hi, my name is Alexandra. I'm from the Council on Foreign Relations. First, thank you so much for the presentation and discussion. It's been very interesting. I was wondering, you talked about how we've seen a feminist awakening, particularly in the past 3 years. Have you seen an uptick in feminist activism and an awakening in the last year, particularly after the MeToo movement started? And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the MeToo movement in China.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what the Me Too movement has done is really showed, first of all, that the many years of a very hard organizing and suffering by these grassroots feminist activists, many years, they've laid the foundation, they've made the ground very fertile for something like Me Too to blossom. And so I think the Me Too movement is just the latest iteration of growing momentum for women's rights support, whether it's through the hardcore political activism or it's just a broader awakening, a broader sense of awareness among young women in particular that there is a lot of entrenched sexism in Chinese society, that this is really unfair, and most importantly, that these women don't have to suffer in silence anymore because they can see that there is strength in numbers, and they can see other women who are like them going public against all odds at this very severe risk of retaliation that can involve police detention even. I mean, we didn't have time to get into it, but some of the Me Too activists, in addition to the original feminist activists, have been taken into custody, and they're still missing now. So the women who are coming out with their personal stories of abuse are doing so against these enormous obstacles, so much greater than the obstacles faced by women in, say, the United States. And we all know here in the US how difficult it is and how stigmatized you will be or attacked or retaliated against for coming out with an accusation of sexual violence. I mean, just look at the Kavanaugh hearings recently. But as difficult as it is in the US, it's exponentially more difficult for women in China. And yet that does not stop. I mean, that doesn't stop these young women from coming forward. And I don't see any signs that that momentum is ceasing in any way. And I also think that Me Too is just one iteration, and that we're likely to see more things develop, that the momentum is going to continue to grow. And what gives me a lot of hope when I'm looking at these young women, I know that the Chinese government, obviously, they're taking on the world's most powerful authoritarian regime. And we know very well how brutal the government can be when it is determined to wipe out a social movement. But I believe that the women's rights movement is actually potentially or even already the most transformative social movement that we've seen in China since 1989. And I certainly believe it has the potential to become incredibly transformative because, for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that it appeals to tens of millions of women, young women across China. It's not something that can be wiped out by jailing a few dozen or several hundred young feminist activists, because there are going to be so many more young women who emerge, to pick up the fight. So that's what's really incredible about what's happening in China today.
Okay, take another question. Yes, in the back over here.
Hello, my name is Andrew Toney, and I'm wondering, not only as a male ally, but as a foreign ally, how do you engage with this market in the sense that, I don't want to end up being banned from going back to China at some point, but how do I engage with it and help push things forward?
Well, thank you for being a male ally. Those are so incredibly important. I encourage other men to be allies as well. I would say, there are many ways that you can get involved in finding out more about China's feminist movement. And in fact, the global diaspora is really important to sustaining the momentum of women's rights improvements. There are quite a lot of young women who are studying, young Chinese women who are studying in the US and in other universities around the world, who are really getting involved in the feminist movement. And they're very important in exchanging ideas, sending information back to their friends back in China, where the access to information is much more difficult. And so in the US, there's the group, the Chinese Feminist Collective, that was started by this woman, Liu Pin, who was the founding editor of Feminist Voices, the most influential feminist website that was banned a few months ago. You can find on Twitter, Free Chinese Feminists, and they're on Facebook as well. There are ways that you can, get involved even as an American ally, but I wouldn't be afraid as an American of being banned from China just because you're expressing solidarity.
Another question? Yes, this gentleman here. Going to let the men ask some questions, but we'll get to women too.
This is very interesting. I'd like to ask both of you a little bit about sort of the ideological pushback from government, society, larger society. It's very typical in China for the government as well as older, more conservative people to push back and say, well, this MeToo movement, this feminism, this is all Western stuff. This is all spiritual pollution. Do you see that kind of rhetoric being resurrected, that kind of cultural revolution, post-cultural rhetoric about this is Western, this is spiritual pollution, and we don't want anything to do with it?
Can you identify yourself?
My name is Eric Hyatt. I am a fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations on the Hill.
Great, terrific. Okay.
Did you want to say something?
Why don't you go?
Sure, yes. Well, yes, we see a lot of that. There's a huge backlash to feminism in China. A lot of that is government orchestrated. And of course, the government has these incredibly brutal, powerful tools at its disposal. It can range from actually jailing young women who are taking part, to disappearing them if they become too prominent, to simply deleting their post on the internet, which happens all the time. And then banning the Feminist Voices, which was, the most popular feminist website. And then when those feminist voices are muffled because they're constantly being censored and disappeared from the internet, that means there's a lot, the other voices, the backlash, misogynistic, abusive voices, including, there are, these totally fake conspiracy, very vicious, misogynistic lies being spread about feminists in China. Then those voices are magnified. Part of the magnifying of those misogynistic voices is deliberately coming from the government. Part of it is naturally occurring from just sexists who just agree that women should be kept down. And we see, of course, we see a lot of that all around the world. But the difference is that in China, you have this powerful, government that is actively pushing this misogynistic line. And yet again, that's what is so astonishing about the continuing growth of the women's rights movement, is that in spite of the magnification of all this misogynistic abuse online, and these women being taken in for detention, being warned that they're going to be tried for subversion, one of the lines of attack that is often used by security agents or, on campus, Communist Party advisors will actually warn young women that if they continue to take part in MeToo activism, that they will be seen as a tool of hostile Western forces, and that then they could be tried for subversion. And in fact, that's exactly what happened to one young woman at Peking University named Yue Xin, who wrote in great detail about how after her MeToo activism on campus, in the middle of the night at 1 a.m., her communist advisor came into her dorm room with her mother in tow and then demanded that she delete all of her files on her computer and on her phone related to her MeToo activism, and threatened her and said, look, you could go to jail for subversion because of this. Well, that did not silence her. In fact, it just fueled her anger even more. And then after she graduated, she went down south and to Shenzhen and started to take part in an effort to unionize workers at a factory. And so there's also one thing we didn't have time to discuss, was the overlapping of the women's rights movement with the labor rights movement that's increasingly happening. And also that's on the level of activism. There are feminist activists who are organizing workers increasingly, and among the workers themselves, women workers in factories are increasingly on the front lines of labor unrest in China. And so, but this line that, if you're doing this, you must be, being used as a tool of anti-China hostile forces. That must be your, reason for doing this. That's commonly used as, as a strategy by the security state.
Okay, let's take another question. There's so many questions. I just want to get some more in if we can. Yes, in the back.
Hi, it's Christine Grimaldi. I'm very interested in the reproductive justice element of what's going on. You talked about forced abortions and forced IUDs under the one-child policy, which is obviously abominable. But now I'm wondering if there are, quote-unquote, pro-life forces that are at work in China, if the laws are changing to become more anti-abortion, and if there has been any Western anti-abortion influence. We know the anti-abortion groups in America spent an inordinate amount of money in Ireland trying to influence that vote. So I'm just interested in that kind of interplay.
Well, there has been some concerns that for example, that this push for more babies to raise the birth rates is going to cause a rollback of women's reproductive rights. So some provinces have actually put some limits on late-term abortions now. And I think the argument they made there was it's for the women's health, it's for other issues, but certainly women activists fear that that's just a sort of a fig leaf for that. But these are early days so far, so it's not so easy to tell. Insofar as the pro-life activists' involvement in the one-child policy, I mean, for a very long time, the pro-lifers here were the strongest supporters, the strongest opposers of the one-child policy in China, which they saw as, which was in line with their agenda and targets. So when I wrote the book, I remember I got a lot of approaches from pro-life forces to give talks and sort of get me on board with their agenda, which I was not, because, I do remember hearing about this because, for example, one very notable pro-life group here, I remember they were citing China as an example. They were like, yes, and all these abortions cause cancer, and I was like, what, really, where? And of course it wasn't true at all. So, the answer is, a tool can be used both ways, right? Whether you force women to have abortions or you prevent them from having abortions, the end result is still the same. A woman does not have control. And so I think this is a problem that some people have a perception, oh, well, China, they've got so much reproductive freedoms. No, it's still control of a sort, birth control, yeah.
Yeah, whatever policy you look at, it's all about controlling women's bodies. Whether it's telling them, as in the early communist era, telling them that they should have as many babies as possible, and then retrenching and saying, no, you can only, in the cities, you can only have one baby, and then now it's gone back to, okay, now you should have 2 babies or possibly even more. There's certainly talk of, right now the policy is officially two children, but there's talk that they may eliminate birth restrictions, but whatever they end up doing, they are going to continue to see women as tools of this, reproductive tools of the state.
All right, question, let's take one from this side of the room, right here. This woman over here with the laptop. Wait for the mic, it's coming your way. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Sang Kim. I'm a Korean intern at Inter-American Commission of Women, a Korean intern. So right now I'm working on analyzing women's participation in political, legislative and judicial level in the member countries of Organization of American States. So I started to wonder if the situation in China, because we've been mostly talking about activists or in public and private sphere, but in terms of, so for example, when they enacted the law against domestic violence, was there women involved in that process? Was there, existence, or was it just another power dialogue happened by external power? And another question would be, if there is any women figure in their history or culture or society that women can look up on as an independent woman who decides what she wants to be, how she wants to be, because I'm trying to think of the work I'm doing right now and the culture. I'm from Korean culture. In terms of Korea, we have several women politicians, several women in history, independent movements involved we can think of when we try to call any women. But I was wondering if Chinese women have that opportunity to think of one.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Is there a Chinese female role model?
Well, I actually write quite a bit in the book about the history of feminism in China's revolutionary history. And there are some extraordinary feminists at the turn of the century in particular, but also with the origins of the Chinese Communist Party. Some of these really famous, inspiring revolutionary feminists were included Qiu Jin, who was a real warrior and writer, who ended up being beheaded in 1907 for plotting to overthrow the Qing Empire. But some of her writing, and another incredible feminist revolutionary was He Yinzhen, who also wrote it around the same time, and they contributed to the overthrow of the dynastic era and the beginning of the Republican era in China. And then, I could go on. But what's interesting about the history of strong women and feminists in communist Chinese history is that these voices, these figures have largely been erased. Even though you may hear about them from time to time, this is definitely a deliberate strategy to just present. It's part of the patriarchal nature of Communist Party rule. But with regard to the domestic violence law, that was passed because of many years, at least 15 years of activism by women.
There was a first question, before that. She had two questions.
Oh, well, I mean, the political representation of women is really incredibly low. It was never high to begin with. I mean, there was never a woman on the elite standing committee of the Politburo ever in communist Chinese history. And in fact, the political representation of women, even today on the Politburo, there's only one woman. The Politburo is one echelon below the elite.
25 members in the Politburo.
Right, so there's 1 out of 25 women, and then on the Central Committee, which is the next rung down, it's something like slightly over 4%, which is actually decreased in recent years. So that the political representation of women at the national level is actually decreasing from a very low point to even lower.
All right, we're going to take one last question. This woman over here.
I'll make a comment
No.
after your question.
Okay, we'll take the last question, and then we'll let you make the comment, and then we'll come back to May and Leda. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm from the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much. I was wondering, I am reading Rebecca Traister's new book, and she makes the excellent point that feminism is a threat to every government because there isn't a government in the world that was created to necessarily serve women. So I'm wondering if China's government is learning from other governments about how to best repress, and if other governments are learning from China's government.
Yeah.
Okay, before you answer that, let's just take the microphone up front. This woman like to make a short comment.
That's my mom.
Oh, hey, welcome.
Everybody.
Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Can you take the microphone, though? All right. Thank you.
My comment is, you mentioned the 齐家治国平天下. Actually, that's genderless. We all, in my period, the Republican period, and everybody, just think that it doesn't apply to men alone. We all the women, and my classmates from Taiwan University, half of them were in sciences and engineering. Half of them, my class, and in fact, the number one who ran in the class was teaching physics at Georgetown University. I think she still does. Mm-hmm. So there is no such historical, prevention from women to doing anything. 齐家治国平天下. So I don't know when they appropriated that.
So it's been reinterpreted.
That that they appropriated that to mean that it's only for men. It's for women as well. So we all need to do that. And another thing I would like to comment is, since we are in Washington D.C., if anyone knows any people in the embassy, it's a very direct route. I'll tell you why. I'm a campaigner of anti-smoking. And since I have been invited to many universities as visiting professors in China, I always use the last 15 minutes to deliver my anti-smoking campaign. Because as you know, China is, health is the biggest issue in any country. And now, by the way, in our election, the Democrats are, this is number one also. This is issue number one, healthcare. And for China, and Bonnie mentioned legislation. Even though China had so many legislations anti-smoking, and you see the restaurants, 不仅吸烟, no use. That's that legislation only. Until one day, I was in the same plane as the ambassador of China. And when I saw him, I could not let him go away. So I just moved forward to be, at Dallas Airport, you have the truck to truck you to the depot. Anyway, so I just moved next to him. And I told him about how serious the smoking issue is, because I had just come from visiting my daughter in Beijing, and there were 2 shops. One was a Russian cake shop. The other was, this selling Western cakes. Chinese love Western cakes, pastry. They were all closed, and they were all selling cigarettes. So, and then the ambassador was very interested because he had been carrying that message for so long already, and he took out his notebook. He said, "Tell me the address." So I gave him the address and gave him the names of these stores. Okay, so if you have any friends with the ambassador or even, anybody, just do your direct talk, give your campaign there. Another example I want to...
If you don't mind, we're already past
Okay,
time.
that's
All right, but thank you so much for your comments. So let me turn back to the panelists here for their final remarks and the answer to the question in the back. Leda?
Yeah. Addressing the idea of feminism being a threat to governments everywhere, well, it's definitely a threat to autocracies in particular. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a threat to, all democratic governments. But I actually write about this at the end of my book as well, because I analyze China's patriarchal authoritarianism. But if you look at the global rise of authoritarianism and fascism in general, it always has misogyny at its core. There is not a single strongman ruler or autocrat in this world who supports feminism or women's rights. I mean, all of these issues are fundamental to asserting authoritarian control over the entire population. They want women to return to the home. They want women to have more babies in many cases. They want women to be dutiful wives and mothers. And so you just point to so many examples from, the Philippines. Duterte is incredibly misogynistic. Look at Russia's Putin. I mean, and the newly elected leader of Brazil. So it's not just, some of these, and the United States, of course. I mean, that's another classic example in our own country. Clearly, feminism is a threat. And that's why these men in power are so terrified of feminists.
Is there any evidence that the Chinese are learning from any of these
well,
other
I
countries?
think that, I mean, I don't know. I don't know. I think there's certainly everybody, all of these strongman authoritarian rulers are all influenced in each other, and in many ways they're all praising each other. They're all feeding on each other's rhetoric. They often meet, and if you look at our president, he's always praising these autocrats, and so I don't know, who started it necessarily, but it's definitely a cycle that we're in right now. But one of the things that gives me a lot of hope is that it's not just the women's rights movement in China. There are very strong women's rights movements that are growing in some other countries as well that are winning serious victories. Look at Ireland, for example. I mean, that was just a stunning victory against the incredibly patriarchal Catholic Church that is so powerful. And so this is why I believe that if you believe in freedom and democracy globally, you must support women's rights, and you should be supporting women's rights activists on the ground who know what they're doing. And there is something very dynamic and successful and powerful about these movements because their message resonates across their societies. And so rather than, just identifying so-and-so male hero as the guy who's going to lead the country out of authoritarianism, we should be supporting women's rights activists and women's rights generally around the world.
I think the methods are, yeah.
Thank you. Let's have some applause here. All right. Final words, Meg.
I think the methods may be more sophisticated over time, but the playbook is always the same. Silence women, control their bodies, and gaslight them and tell them when they're wrong, when they're right. And we can see it in a variety of different ways with, Twitter or whatever the case may be with technology. But it's the same thing. So if you see these hallmarks, and we do in many societies, then we have to recognize the beast for what it is. Yeah, thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank both of you for coming. It's been a terrific discussion, and thank you for writing the book. And I do hope you'll all read it. And later we'll be signing copies outside. Please join me in thanking Leda Hongfitcher.
Oh, thank you.